The banquet hall of the Franklin Veterans Center glowed with soft amber lights. Long tables were adorned with medals, faded photographs, and the sharp clink of glassware echoed through the spacious room. It was the 40-year reunion of the 218th Infantry Division, a unit forged in the dust and fire of the Middle East decades ago. Laughter rippled across the hall as old comrades embraced, recounted war stories, and swapped tales that blurred the line between memory and myth. Some arrived with children and grandchildren, others with their canes and prosthetic limbs, but all came with pride etched into their posture. All except one. Thomas Granger, 73 years old, entered through the side door wearing a dark gray suit that fit just a little too loose. He walked with a cane, slow, deliberate steps, and scanned the room with hesitant eyes. His silver hair was combed flat, and his tie, though neat, looked like it had been tied with trembling hands. He wasn't met with handshakes or backslaps. No one called out his name. In fact, most turned away. A few glanced in his direction and muttered under their breath. One man nudged another and whispered, "Didn't think he'd show his face again." Thomas said nothing. He just nodded faintly, found a seat near the back, a small table in the corner slightly apart from the rest, and sat down, quietly pouring himself a glass of water. From that vantage point, he watched the room fill with laughter, old jokes, and younger generations hanging on every word from their veteran elders. No one approached him. No one sat beside him. To many in the room he was that guy, the man whose name had become attached to a dark memory from the past. Whispers of abandonment, a mission gone wrong, a retreat that allegedly cost lives. He had never been formally accused of wrongdoing, but in the court of brotherhood, he had long since been found guilty. And yet, Thomas came anyway. Not to explain, not to argue, but to listen. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the unit banner that hung from the far wall. It was faded, but the motto still shone clear: "No man left behind." Thomas blinked slowly. The irony wasn't lost on him. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that the truth was finally about to speak, and this time someone powerful was ready to speak it. As the reunion dinner progressed, the energy in the room grew louder and warmer, except around the corner table where Thomas Granger remained seated, quiet and alone. The conversations at other tables flowed with ease, stories of camaraderie, survival, and the old days. Plates clinked, glasses raised, and laughter filled the gaps between tales of sandstorms, surprise ambushes, and makeshift birthday cakes baked in mess tents. But whenever Thomas's name was mentioned, voices dropped. "He left us pinned in the valley that night," one man muttered to another. "Captain Doyle and 5 others didn't make it because he pulled back. I still remember the radio going silent when we needed him most." They weren't shouting. No one confronted him directly, but the disapproval hung thick in the air, invisible but undeniable. Thomas could feel every bit of it. He didn't touch his food. He didn't try to explain. He knew what they thought, and had thought for over 40 years. The story that followed him like a shadow. A failed mission in a dry canyon. A unit ambushed. And Thomas, then a young staff sergeant, ordered to hold position, but retreating instead. The official report had been murky. No court-martial, no formal charges. But that didn't stop the rumors. They festered, unchallenged, and in the absence of truth, assumptions grew into verdicts. He had lived with those verdicts ever since, from former comrades turning away in grocery store aisles to invitations never arriving for previous reunions. He wasn't just forgotten. He was avoided. Across the room, General Marcus Ellison, now retired but still carrying the commanding presence of a battlefield leader, stood talking to a group of younger attendees. He glanced at Thomas several times throughout the evening, his expression unreadable, focused, tight. Finally, as the dinner plates were cleared and the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone to begin speeches, General Ellison leaned over and whispered something to the event organizer. Then he walked up to the podium. The room immediately quieted. "Before we begin tonight's formal recognitions," the general said, scanning the crowd with steely eyes, "I want to speak about truth, the kind that sometimes takes decades to surface." He paused. No one moved. "I've heard the whispers," he continued. "We've all heard the version of a story about a man who walked away from a firefight, who cost lives. A story about retreat, cowardice, shame." Many in the room nodded. Thomas lowered his eyes. The general's voice sharpened. "But what if that story was wrong?" Gasps. Chairs creaked. Brows furrowed. General Ellison turned and pointed slowly toward the back of the room. "What if the man you've judged for 40 years is the one who saved mine?" All heads turned. Thomas slowly looked up, his expression frozen in disbelief. The general stepped away from the podium, walked toward him. And with every step, the room held its breath. Something big was about to happen, and this time the silence wouldn't be against Thomas Granger. It would be for him. General Marcus Ellison stopped just a few feet from the small table where Thomas Granger sat frozen, eyes wide, lips slightly parted as though caught between breath and disbelief. The general turned to the room. "I was a captain back then," he said. "Operation Canyon Shield, 1983. We were on recon. Everything was supposed to be routine. It wasn't." He let the words hang in the silence. "We walked straight into an ambush." Murmurs echoed through the hall. Many of the men there had been on that mission, or knew someone who had. The command line was broken. Air support was delayed. We had no satellite recon, no maps for the upper ridge. Chaos. We lost visibility, and the radios were compromised. What we didn't lose was Granger. He turned to Thomas, now visibly shaken, blinking rapidly, his fingers clutching the edge of the table like it was all that tethered him to the moment. "You were our forward scout. You knew the terrain better than anyone. You could have pulled out. But you didn't." The room was silent. General Ellison continued, voice steady. "Granger disobeyed my original transmission. He didn't follow the fallback order. And thank God he didn't. Because that fallback zone was being zeroed in on by artillery. I didn't know. He did." The crowd began to shift, eyebrows raised, backs straightened. "He rerouted half the unit to higher ground, shielded the wounded with his own fire team. He stayed behind, alone, to jam enemy comms and throw off their signal tracking. When we regrouped, we didn't know how or why. We only knew we were alive." He looked out across the stunned crowd. "And we never asked." He turned back to Thomas. "I found the sealed report 2 years ago. It was declassified last spring. I read every word. You were advised not to speak about your counter-command actions under threat of dishonorable discharge. You stayed silent for 40 years, while the rest of us told a lie." A gasp. Someone dropped their fork. Thomas swallowed hard. His voice came out hoarse. I did what I thought would keep them alive." General Ellison nodded. "And you did, including me." He raised his hand in salute. "In front of every man in this room, and every family member who believed the wrong version of the story, I say this: Sergeant Thomas Granger is not a deserter. He is a protector, a tactician, a leader, and he is one of the finest men I've ever served with." The hall stood in stunned silence. Then, slowly, one by one, people began to rise. A few older veterans straightened their backs and raised trembling salutes. Someone clapped, then another, and another, until the room was on its feet, roaring in applause. Thomas, overwhelmed, remained seated. His eyes shimmered with tears. His hands trembled. He hadn't cried in decades. Not in combat, not when the rumors began, not when he lost friends who turned their backs. But now, surrounded by the very men who once looked away, he felt something break loose, not in pain, but in relief. A younger veteran came forward and knelt beside him. "I grew up hearing your name whispered like a warning. I'm sorry, sir. So sorry." Thomas looked at him and offered a gentle smile. "You believed what you were told. I did too." Later that evening, as the crowd slowly thinned and the lights dimmed, Thomas found himself surrounded by laughter, handshakes, even hugs. The silence was gone. And in its place was something Thomas never thought he'd feel again: belonging. The next morning, Thomas Granger awoke in his modest motel room to the sound of his phone buzzing non-stop. Messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years, missed calls from old friends, even a voicemail from his son, the first in almost a decade. "Dad," the voice said, shaky. "I saw the clip. I didn't know. I'm sorry. I'm so proud of you." Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, the morning sun spilling across the floor, and just listened, again and again. By afternoon, photos and video clips from the reunion had already made their way online. A short clip, just 20 seconds long, showed General Ellison saluting him. The title read, "The Truth Took 40 Years, a Veteran Finally Vindicated." Within hours, it had gone viral. But the public attention was nothing compared to what happened back home. When Thomas returned to his small town 2 days later, he found something waiting for him. Respect. The local American Legion post, where he used to sit alone at the end of the bar, had put up a banner in his honor. "Welcome home, Sergeant Granger." Beneath it, his name was listed in gold letters beside the motto, "Integrity in silence, honor in action." For the first time in years, the town paper printed his name without controversy. The mayor invited him to speak at the upcoming Memorial Day event. A teacher from the local high school called to ask if he'd be willing to speak to students about ethics and courage. At first, Thomas hesitated. He had never seen himself as a man with something to say. He preferred to listen, to observe. But he realized something had changed, not just in how others saw him, but how he saw himself. He accepted. At the next veteran ceremony, Thomas took the stage in a simple navy blazer. No medals, no ribbons, just a folded piece of paper in his hand and a stillness in his presence that spoke louder than any speech. "I'm not here to talk about war," he began. "I'm here to talk about the damage silence can cause, and also the healing it can bring." He told the crowd that he never defended himself because he thought defending others was enough. "But the truth," he said, "deserves to breathe, even if it takes a lifetime." He finished to a standing ovation. In the weeks that followed, Thomas received dozens of letters from fellow veterans. Some who had once doubted him, others who had their own unspoken burdens. He read every single one. Each word felt like a brick being lifted from a wall he had spent decades building around his heart. And brick by brick it was finally coming down. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Thomas Granger returned to the old military cemetery just outside town. He wore no uniform, no medal, only a clean white shirt, black slacks, and the same cane he had leaned on for years. The autumn breeze rustled the flags lining each grave, and the early sunlight washed the stone markers in golden calm. He walked slowly toward a particular headstone. Captain Richard Doyle, a name that had haunted him for 4 decades. Thomas stood in silence, then knelt with great effort, resting one hand gently on the stone. "I told you I'd be back," he whispered. "And they finally know." His voice didn't shake. It was steady, not because the pain had vanished, but because he no longer carried it alone. As he stood, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw General Ellison approaching, this time not in dress blues, but in jeans and a plain shirt. He stopped beside Thomas and nodded toward the grave. "I visit him every year. the general said quietly. But this year feels different. They stood together, two old soldiers side by side. No ceremony, no crowd. Just the sound of wind through trees and decades of unspoken words now released into the air. Ellison turned to him. "You never asked for recognition. But I want you to know, in every after-action report I've read, every medal I've pinned, I've never seen sacrifice done so silently." Thomas looked down, then smiled faintly. "Sometimes silence speaks loudest." The general stepped back and saluted, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. And this time, Thomas returned the gesture. It would be the last time he saluted in uniform, but not the last time he was remembered.
If this story touched your heart, we'd be honored to have you with us. Each day we share quiet moments that remind us what still matters. You can subscribe below to join us.